Broadly speaking, there are two distinct types of virtue in this life. For the purposes of this video series, I'm going to refer to them as the hard virtues and the soft virtues, two distinct types of virtue. I think we can understand both of them better and we can get a handle on what I'm trying to say here if we consider the life of a police officer for a second. So that's what we're going to do in this first episode. First, let's consider a police officer when he's at work, when he's on duty. What does that entail? What does it look like when a police officer is on duty? Well, All About Career summarizes the job description by saying, in a nutshell, police officers maintain law and order, protect the general public, investigate crimes, and prevent criminal activity. If you become a police officer, your career will be all about crime prevention, prosecution, and punishment. I think perhaps a more succinct way of describing the job is to say that the police exist to uphold and enforce the cause of justice. That word justice encapsulates and distills down into one word the life and role of a police officer. They make sure that murderers, rapists, thieves, drug dealers, money launderers, terrorists, and so forth are brought to justice so that the general public are protected from the harms of these evildoers. Now, this is all very good so far, but let's think about what that actually looks like in practice. What does it mean? What does it look like to uphold and enforce justice? Honestly, it can be quite an uncomfortable thing to think about. Enforcing justice can be a violent thing, an uncompromising thing, and a shocking thing. Sometimes enforcing justice means chasing uncooperative criminals down the street and wrestling them to the floor and fighting with them. Sometimes it means barging into people's homes to catch them unawares and red-handed. Sometimes it means beating violent offenders into submission with batons. Sometimes it means immobilizing them with tasers or dispersing warring crowds with water cannon. Sometimes it means forcibly handcuffing criminals at their wrists and banishing them to austere, barred jail cells for years and years of their lives. As a last resort, if someone is posing an immediate and mortal threat to innocent life, sometimes enforcing justice even means drawing a gun and shooting that evildoer dead. Enforcing justice is a violent thing, it's an uncompromising thing, and it's often a shocking thing. This was the case in December 2019 for an Islamic terrorist called Usman Khan. Khan had been jailed in 2012 for plotting an attack on the London Stock Exchange, but was released halfway through his 16-year sentence. Not long after his release, he then resurfaced in Fishmongers Hall near London Bridge in England, seemingly equipped with a suicide vest and a knife. He was rampaging around the area, indiscriminately stabbing members of the public. Khan managed to kill 2 innocent people that day, seriously injure 3, and he was fighting with some brave civilians when the London Metropolitan Police arrived on the scene. Realising that Khan posed a deadly threat to these people, as well as innocent bystanders, that he was not responding to verbal commands to desist, and that he appeared to be reaching for the trigger on his suicide vest, and obviously if he'd blown himself up, that would have killed a lot more people. They were left with no option that day but to fire their weapons and to shoot Usman Khan dead. Now, there are several adjectives that could be used to describe the police response that day. We could say it was shocking, and we'd be right to say so. We could say it was violent, fierce, terrifying, sad. All of those words would be perfectly applicable to that situation. Perhaps onlookers would have had to turn away in shock as the shots were fired because it was so brutal to watch a man being killed in front of their eyes. But after all was said and done, we would have to rest on the conclusion that what the police had done that day was ultimately good. It was good that Usman Khan, this unrepentant madman, had been stopped in his tracks. It was good that he'd been thwarted in his murderous rampage. It was good that he'd been blocked from taking more innocent lives. The police officers had carried out their duty well that day. They had fulfilled their job description to uphold the cause of justice. They had extinguished evil and they had protected the innocent. It was a good job, well done. Violent and uncomfortable though it was to watch and to witness, they had done what was right, they had done what was good. This is why justice can be considered a hard virtue, because although it's undoubtedly good and certainly it's necessary, its implementation is often shocking, violent, terrifying, and uncompromising. Now, according to dictionary.com, to be just means to be guided by truth, reason, justice, and fairness. That which is done according to principle, equitable, proper. That which is right, rightful, lawful. That which is in keeping with truth or fact, true, correct. All these words that are connected to justice, truth, fact, reason, righteousness, lawfulness, fairness, all of these words can also be considered a part of the hard virtue set. To deal in any of these is to deal in uncompromising and decisive things. If you deal in truth, then you're dealing in what's right and what's wrong. If you're dealing in fact, you're dealing in what is and what isn't. If you're dealing in righteousness, you're dealing in what's moral and what's immoral. You're dealing in very black and white, uncompromising things. But that will become clear as we progress in this series. First, let's get acquainted with the soft virtues as well. And we can perhaps best understand these by considering the same police officer, the exact same guy, when he finishes his shift, takes off his uniform, and returns home to see his wife and his family. After all, would we expect to see him at home behaving in the same way that he behaved at work? Would he be as unyielding and hard with his family as he'd been with criminals and terrorists? Probably not. I hope not. Certainly not if he's a good man. He wouldn't behave in the same way. In the home context, we would expect to see him exhibiting a rather different set of virtues, a softer set of virtues. We might see the man showing love for his wife, for example, when he comes through the front door by showering her with hugs and kisses. We'd perhaps see him wrestling with his kids on the floor, but with gentleness, withholding his true strength, so that they can clamber over him and pin him to the floor. He may show mercy and grace and forgiveness when a flailing foot accidentally strikes him on the face. Perhaps he'd show kindness and compassion if he accidentally hurt them. Perhaps later that evening, we might see him teaching his children to read their bedtime story and showing patience and forbearance when they're not getting the words right. And these would be the soft virtues. They perhaps need less explaining, I think. We very easily recognize these words as being virtuous. Love, forgiveness, grace, mercy, patience, humility, kindness. We easily recognize these things as being virtuous. And they're good. They're every bit as good as the hard virtues. Of course they are. But they obviously just look very different in their application. And this is what we need to understand then. Indeed, this is the foundation for this whole series. The goodness that exists within our police officer manifests itself in two very different ways throughout the course of his life. Sometimes the good within him expresses itself in hard ways, and sometimes it expresses itself in soft ways. Sometimes his goodness is fierce, and sometimes it's gentle. Sometimes it's violent, and sometimes it's compassionate. Sometimes it's uncompromising and unyielding, and sometimes it's patient and forbearing. But it's the same goodness. That's the key. It's the same goodness at work in both circumstances. The police officer demonstrates the hard virtues at work because that is good. Upholding justice, punishing evil, and establishing truth, that is good. And it's the same police officer that demonstrates the soft virtues at home because that is good too, showing love, grace, compassion, mercy, kindness to his family. It's the same core good that is driving these very different behaviors in very different contexts. I think finally, to emphasize just how important both kinds of virtue are, let's imagine a scenario where the police officer tries to navigate life using only one of the sets and never the other one. So for example, let's imagine a police officer who uses only the soft virtues. So he goes to work and he comes across a thief, but he refuses to tackle that thief because he wants to be compassionate to the thief. He sees a money launderer, but he turns a blind eye to it because he wants to show kindness to the money launderer. Imagine he lets a criminal go unpunished because he doesn't think it would be very loving of him to put him in a cold, barred jail cell. Or let's bring it into real life. Imagine the officer who shot Usman Khan on London Bridge decided to let him go free and continue on his murderous rampage because he wanted to be gentle and patient and forbearing and kind to the terrorist. What would we think of that officer who refuses to employ the hard virtues at any time? Well, probably at best, we'd think him incompetent, cowardly, and completely unfit for his job, and at worst, we'd probably suspect that he was corrupt in some way, an accomplice of the evil. Whatever we thought of him, we wouldn't think of him as being a good man, though. Because while there is a time for the soft virtues, no doubt about it, there's a time to break out the hard edge as well. There's a time for justice. And if he refuses to do what is necessary, he can't call himself good. Neither a good officer, nor a good man. On the other hand, let's consider the reverse now. Imagine a scenario where the police officer tries to navigate life using only the hard virtues and never the soft. So let's imagine he returns home from a shift and he doesn't show any love for his wife, and he gives no hugs and no kisses. When his children try to play wrestling games with him, he doesn't withhold his strength, but he beats them without mercy, because the fact is, he's bigger, he's stronger. When one child accidentally whacks him on the face with a flailing arm, imagine that he whacks them back equally hard, because that's justice, an eye for an eye. When the child is struggling to read their bedtime story, imagine that he has no patience, so he launches into a furious tirade, demanding that they get it right, to get the facts of the story right. Imagine his house is entirely without compassion, so his wife and kids are terrified of him. What would we think of the man who refuses to demonstrate the soft virtues at any time? Probably at best, we'd think him a cold-hearted monster who is completely unfit to be a husband or a father, and we'd feel very sorry for his family having to put up with him. And at worst, we'd be calling the police or social services to rescue them from the reign of this monstrous tyrant. Whatever we thought of him though, we wouldn't think of him as being a good man, because while there is a time for the hard virtues, no doubt about it, there must be a time for the soft virtues as well. And if he never demonstrates them, he simply cannot call himself good. So from these examples then, we can see that it's not wise to jettison either virtue set entirely. We need both to be held in balance to be considered good. If we try to utilize only one set without the other, what begins as a virtue can actually turn into a vice. It's very important to remember, all soft and no hard, that leads to evil. All hard and no soft does likewise, that leads to evil as well. Being a good person necessarily means holding both in balance, expressing both in the right context and in the right measure.